Storms, Pause, Reflect, Act, the UVic Faculty of Education COVID-19 Research Symposium taking place every Wednesday in May from noon to 1 p.m. So thanks for joining us today. My name is Tanya Battersby, and I'm the Research and Grants Facilitator here in the Faculty of Education, and I'll be facilitating today's session. I'd like to begin by respectfully acknowledging that UVic is located on the traditional territory of the Lekwungen peoples and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. So a couple of housekeeping items before we begin. So I think we're all pretty Zoom literate by now, but just a reminder to please keep yourself muted unless you're speaking. And if possible, please keep your video on because it's nice for the presenters to be able to see people's faces when they're speaking. If you run into any trouble using Zoom during the session and you need technical support, please feel free to ask for help in the chat. Courtney and Hector are here and they'll be monitoring the chat. They're on standby to help you troubleshoot any issues that may come up. And finally, we're recording the presentations and this event is being live streamed on our YouTube channel today. So the link to the video for the session will also be posted on the event homepage for viewing after the session. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first presentation for today. The title is Teacher Candidates Learning to Teach in COVID-19 Conditions. Our presenters are Kathy Sanford, Tanya Manning-Lewis, and Thiago Hinkel, and I'd like to tell you a bit about them to begin. Kathy Sanford is a professor in the Faculty of Education at the University of Victoria. Her research interests include teacher education, assessment, digital portfolios, non-formal and informal adult education, gender pedagogy, decolonizing and anti-oppressive pedagogies, and multiliteracies. Kathy's research interests relate to education and community engagement, focusing on ways to create and sustain meaningful partnerships across sectors. Her work is located in schools, museums, libraries, and in online environments. Kathy is a feminist social justice educator and teacher educator, utilizing intersectionality as a framework to understand issues of equity as they relate to race, gender, and class. She works with partnerships of schools, teacher education programs, and the Ministry of Education to further 21st century understandings of learning and of learners' needs. Dr. Tanya Manning-Lewis is a sessional instructor at the University of Victoria in the Department of Curriculum Instruction and a teacher in the Victoria School District 61. Her research interests include gender, marginality, and the Caribbean identity, privileging youth voices, ELL and ESL learning, and teacher identity and 21st century learning. Thiago Hinkel started his career nearly 20 years ago as a teacher of English as an additional language in his home country, Brazil, where he also received his master's in education from the University of Joinville in 2014. Thiago moved with his family to Victoria 3 years ago and is today an international PhD candidate and sessional instructor with the Department of Curriculum and Instruction, Faculty of Education at the University of Victoria. Thiago's research interests include the use of digital technologies and the literacies they enable in the context of education, more specifically in the field of teacher education. So I'd like to welcome Kathy, Tanya, and Thiago for their presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have to start off by unmuting. Learned that by now. So we're going to talk a little bit about a research project that we engaged with over the past few months, which was stimulated by an interest in how a group of teacher candidates who were completing a practicum, which happened to be their only practicum because they had missed one due to COVID, learned their roles as teachers and learned in different conditions than they had imagined themselves learning in. And so we were looking at what conditions enabled them to learn from and with teachers about particular things like curriculum, like the diversities of the students they were working with, the context of the schools, and how teachers were adapting to these changing conditions. And so we're going to start over on the right-hand side with the description that what we started with was when we got the grant, completed research ethics, and then invited all of the teacher candidates from the elementary and the secondary post-degree programs to participate in this study. And so we ended up with 14 teacher candidates, some of whom we knew because we had taught them, and some of them whom we didn't. There was a range from elementary, middle, and secondary, and there were both men and women involved in the study. So it was quite a broad scope of the participants. So we conducted 3 sets of interviews with each teacher candidate, beginning with the first week that they were in their practicum, and then halfway through, about 4 or 5 weeks in, and then at the last week of their practicum. And so there was a total of 36 interviews. Tanya was delighted that we had so many interviews to view and analyze. And the interviews lasted 15 to 45 minutes, depending on the availability of the students and what they had to say. So I'm going to turn it to Thiago just for a second to talk about how we did the initial analysis.
Thank you, Kathy. So most of our interviews were carried out via Zoom, and they were recorded using Zoom. And as you might know, when you record a Zoom session today, and as you close it, you end it, it will generate a video for you of that interview. So with those videos of all those interviews, we uploaded them onto YouTube as private videos. So only us, only the research members had access to them. And after you upload a video to YouTube, it will generate transcriptions of your video. So we downloaded those transcripts, and instead of manually having to transcribe all of our 36 interviews, YouTube did the job for us. So by using Google Docs, we created a collaborative document that all these transcripts were transported into that. So all the 3 of us could go in, start organizing those transcripts, and then start analyzing it. And to you, Tanya.
I think I'm going to take it up again for just looking at the COVID. So we're just going to talk briefly about how COVID impacted, and then we're going to come back to it at the end, just because that was what the research was focusing on. So we're happy to report that the practicum students during their practicum were all successful. And we know that because they completed their practicum, and many of them have gone on to get employment in the teaching field since then. So some of the things that came out at the beginning in the first interview were ways in which they were trying to navigate the kinds of scheduling that had changed, the ways in which outdoor activities were enabled or not enabled, the ways in which they had to connect with many fewer students and many different faculty, which will have an impact we'll talk about at the end. Lots of time washing hands. They talked about spending an hour out of the day with those kinds of safety protocols. And of course, in the secondary schools, there was a very different kind of scheduling system, which we'll come back to at the end and talk more about. But Tanya now is going to talk about the findings from each of the 3 rounds of the interviews.
Thank you, Kathy. So after Thiago transcribed all the interviews, we all went through these, and then I started looking at these more in depth and coding to sort of see what were some of the main themes that were emerging from the data. But for the purpose of this presentation, we are going to organize the information according to the round of interviews that were done and what were some of the main ideas that that emerged from the data itself. So in round 1 of the interviews, at the start, we noticed that the teacher candidates were very focused on self. They had quite a few concerns about classroom management, UVic requirements for their practicum, how to make the schedule work, especially for those in the high school system. There were also quite a bit of anxiety around the teaching practicum process and feeling as if they were not prepared enough for that. But at the latter part, we noticed that they do shift to focusing on the students themselves. And this was helped in part by the smaller class sizes that many of them encountered. They had more time with students, and they felt they could be more flexible because there was more time to plan and prep. And again, this was more the case for those teacher candidates who were in the high school system. One thing we noted from the onset is that we identified 3 different types of teacher candidates who participated in the research. We had what we described as leaders or visionaries. And these were the teacher candidates who took risk throughout their practicum. From the start, these students were focused on students' needs rather than their needs as teacher candidates and how to be successful in their practicum. In fact, they were so focused on how they could make the learning more meaningful for their students and were constantly problem solving. So those were the leaders, and they maintained that kind of leadership and visions throughout the practicum and throughout the 3 rounds of interviews. Now, another set of students we identified, teacher candidates we identified, we refer to these candidates as the responders or the implementers during their practicum. These were the candidates who sort of followed their mentor teacher's lead and needed quite a bit of support and guidance throughout, but they managed just the same, and they grew throughout their practicum with the support of their mentor teachers. And then we had the resistors, and the resistors were the teacher candidates who kind of went into their practicum with a fixed mindset about what to expect within the practicum itself, how it should be structured, meeting UVic requirements. And those students were quite anxious about the content, and they kind of stayed focused on self. At least in our first interviews, we noticed that we saw some shift, and I'll speak to these later on. But they sort of went in, as I said, with a fixed mindset that in some ways sort of impacted how they engage with students and the content itself. Overall, we found some of the teacher candidates in the first interviews being quite focused on managing class and behavioral issues. Even though we find them moving beyond this, those were the initial things we noticed from the round 1 interviews. For example, thank you, Thiago. For example, this is just pulling something from one of the teacher candidates to show that these would have been, this particular example would speak to a candidate who had a bit of a fixed mindset and was more concerned about classroom management and meeting UVic requirements. So there was a focus on self. So for this student, the teacher candidate mentioned, we got 21 days of instruction. I'd like to have a tentative plan of, okay, are we doing 13 days of chemistry? How many 4 days of bio, 4 days of physics? Or are we breaking this down? Because those are the sorts of things I need to do for UVic's requirement, right? The student continued to say, it's like I said, it's challenging trying to condense everything down to 5 weeks. So they're basically saying, okay, what are the important things? And then they're cutting out lots of content. It's like 5 weeks of instruction, and when I'm teaching, it's going to be 12. So it's not really indicative learning environment for doing classroom management skills. And just the way the semester is set up. So from this example, as you can see, the student is quite fixated on how to make it work, the schedule work, meeting UVic requirement, being able to manage classroom. And there wasn't a lot of focus on the students and the students' needs and sort of a responsive teaching, at least in initial interviews. In interview 2 now, round 2 of the interviews, as I have mentioned, there is somewhat of a bit of a shift, but we also noticed particular mindset that were relating to students' particular areas of discipline. And let me explain that. For example, we noticed that the students from the social sciences, like socials and English, they were more focused on the students they're teaching, meeting the students' needs. They were more focused on diversity and inclusion as a part of their teaching, not putting aside a section for that, as we have noticed with some candidates, but really making a part of their teaching learning experiences in their classroom, and also taking risk. we have noticed that for those students who are more from a science background or discipline, we're a bit more focused on getting the content covered. They did not see diversity as a part of their classroom setup, and more so as something that they need to probably set aside a little time to teach. So those are some of the things we notice as it relates to the particular discipline and how students address the teaching and concerns and students' needs. So for the science disciplines, there was a lot more focus on covering the content that they need to get through within the set time that was aligned for their practicum. We noticed as well that for students from some of the students from the social background, they from early on, they developed a sort of empathy and connection with their students. While we do see some who saw the students' behaviors as a concern and was a bit more focused on that, especially at the elementary level, some of the teacher candidates were quite concerned about how to regulate students' behaviors. And that seems to be something that they continue focusing on throughout their practicum. So that continuous focus on behavior and management. So they saw their roles as classroom managers or managers of students' behaviors. But there are other teacher candidates who saw their roles as facilitating students' learning, creating a supportive environment, facilitating critical thinking, and developing activities and materials that sort of facilitate that as well. So they saw themselves as co-creators with students, co-learners with students. And for those students, they tend to have a greater connection with their for those teacher candidates, they seem to have a greater connection with their students in their classrooms. And as an example of this, to show students who are more connected to their students and wanting to develop those relationships, one teacher candidate mentioned, I don't want kids to just do what I say. I want them to be able to ask me to justify why I'm doing something. And I want them to be able to have a trusting relationship where they trust me enough that they know that I'm getting them to do something that they don't quite understand, but I do understand. I do know them and I'm giving it to them for a reason that is specific to them as an individual, right? Relationship building is important. So we're seeing that shift, as I've mentioned, where TCs are now moving from focusing on self to focusing on students and students' needs within the classroom, and relationship building was an important part of that process for many of the teacher candidates. As we move on to the round 3 of interviews, as Kathy mentioned, all the teacher candidates were successful in completing their practicum, and many of them right out of completion of the program were hired as teachers on call in the school district or even in new positions in new year. For the teacher candidates overall, when we moved into looking at the data in round 3, overall they have seemed to have developed really valuable relationships with their students and tend to value the relationship with their mentors. For those teacher candidates who had really good relationship with their mentors, they have expressed a need to extend on those relationships and to continue learning from their mentor teachers who were a pivotal part of the process for them and for their growth. They also seem to be developing an identity as a teacher. At the end, you could see that shift where they're looking ahead, they're more confident, they can envision what their classroom will look like. We have seen quite a bit more interest in diversity. And Katie and I smile a bit about that, where diversity is not just finding a little part of something of a content to cover, but really looking at the diverse needs of their students within their classroom and how to address that and how to focus on students. We've seen that developing and evolving throughout the 3 courses of interviews. And although some students were a bit hesitant at the end about really taking risk and branching out on their own like that, overall they were looking forward to that process. And for the teacher candidates, they seem to have, at the end of the interview, seem to have reaffirmed their desire to be teachers. No one indicated that after the practicum, they don't want to no longer be in the classroom. They all seemed enthused at the idea of going out there, having an impact, establishing relationships with students, but they were also more aware of how to pay attention to their context, to themselves and to the students that they're teaching in the classroom or engaging with in the classroom. We noticed through the reflective processes that they started to look at how they negotiate assessment within the classroom, which was an important factor for many students as they grapple with what assessment will look like and how to engage students in assessment that is reflective of students' interests and desires in the classroom itself, and how to provide timely feedback to students without it becoming about just the grade itself. So there were quite a bit of conversations around that. There were also conversations around how they could make classroom more conducive to students' learning, and using not just diverse texts, but finding diverse ways and means of engaging the students, making learning a bit more personalized and making more interconnections across the disciplines. So in sum, if we look at the TCs over the three courses of interviews, we see where they started out a bit hesitant, but then they became more confident students teacher candidates who started to focus on the needs of their learners. And at the end, they felt like they could step out as teachers. An example of this is one teacher candidate mentioned, I feel more confident than ever that this is a profession that is going to just give me a lot of fulfillment. And hopefully I can offer a lot of fulfillment as well. It's just this endless puzzle, isn't it? Like you're never doing it perfect, but there's always chance for improving. And I think for me personally, I like the complex. I like puzzles. I like the idea that I can keep working and working and working at it and get better. And that each new group is going to be unique with their own unique needs. So this is a really perfect example of how much teacher candidates have come into their own and is looking forward to that prospect of going into the classroom and work at being a teacher and knowing that it is not something that is easy, but it's something that they're enthused to do. Thank you.
So just as we go to wrap up, I just wanted to turn it over to Thiago, because one of the things that we did was met as a team and talked about what we were seeing through the data. And that was what enabled Thiago to create this infographic in this particular kind of way. So Thiago, can you just talk a little bit about that before I get to the so what?
Yes, thank you, Kathy. So we wanted to have an artifact that would be a standalone piece that, for example, a poster like the one you're seeing now as a whole, that we could share and not be there present with it, and people would still make sense of it. But then we also wanted something that we could use for a presentation, such as today. So the first thing we did was to put a PDF together, a PDF document by using Canva, this infographic software, which was used to produce this, what you're seeing right now. And we exported that as a PDF file to be used as the background for this this presentation that we have right now. And the color that we have in the background, and maybe people want to use the reactions button in their Zoom to say, do you know what color this is? Have you seen this color before? So the Pantone Institute has elected this one of the colors for 2021. They usually select one color for each year. This year specifically, they are having two colors. This color called Illuminating or Illuminating Yellow, that gives the idea of bright and sparkling with vivacity, and also brings a bit of the color of the sun. So we wanted to have a bright color coming out of a moment of pandemic, giving some hope and light. And also the way things are laid out here, we have an arrow that is going from the right to the left, giving an idea of passage of time that explains all the steps that we took. And we also have a smaller arrow here connecting our so what part to the impact of COVID.
Thanks, Thiago. So just to finalize, we had a lot of fun doing this, actually. It was a lot of work, but the conversations were really great. And one of the key things that we determined, like we sort of had a window into these practicum classrooms by being able to connect with these students on a regular basis. And one of the things that was really significant was how much the mentor and the supervisor mattered. So when we look back at the 3 different types of students we identified that Tanya talked about, when the mentor was able to support and push the students forward in a collegial kind of way, they really were able to grow. When there was a real mismatch, there was a huge problem with them being able to develop the way they wanted to develop. And then there was some who just followed in the footsteps of their mentors. And that was a really good thing for them. They needed to be able to move forward. But that mentor-mentee matching was one of the really key things. A couple of other things were that COVID didn't really limit what they were able to do. They were creative, they were able to respond and work in different kinds of ways. They weren't able to see the whole school experience in the same way. They were just more limited, which actually goes back to the mentor because they only had one adult or maybe 2 that they could connect with, rather than in other times they would have a whole community of people that they could talk to. We also were interested in diversity, and this is where I think it highlighted the importance of continuing this work in a really robust way. They were flirting with looking at diversity and anti-oppression and decolonizing, but really hadn't embedded it into their practice in any significant way, with a couple of small exceptions. So we were really fortunate, I think, that we had this opportunity to do this work. And we're really appreciative that you're here to listen to it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kathy, Tanya, and Thiago. So I think you can stop sharing your slides at this point, but it was very interesting to hear that description of the infographic. And we have a couple of minutes for questions and comments. The time is a bit tight, but if anyone has a pressing question for the presenters, feel free to type the word question in the chat, and then I'll call upon you to unmute yourself and ask your question. I'll also invite everyone to write comments in the chat because the presenters can read any comments or any feedback that you have for them on their presentation. So I'll just, while people are reflecting for a moment, I'll just read the comment from Catherine, I think which she made while Thiago was talking about the infographic, a great series of metaphors, and then Alexander and Hannah both agreed with that. So thank you, Kathy, Tanya, and Thiago for that really insightful presentation, and I think the infographic was a real highlight. So I'm not seeing any questions or comments coming up. And in that case, what I'll do is I'll let participants feel free to post any comments as I'm introducing the next presentation. And so for our next presentation, it's titled Supporting Early Childhood STEM Education During the Pandemic and Afterwards, Examining Parents and Early Childhood Educators' Perceptions of a Digital Toolkit. So we have 4 presenters. Dr. Christine Tippett is an Associate Professor of Science Education in the Faculty of Education at the University of Ottawa. She was an engineer before she obtained her teaching degree, which influences her ways of thinking about science education. Roxana Yanez Gonzalez is a doctoral candidate at the University of Ottawa with extensive experience in early childhood education as a teacher, frontline educator, and college professor. She is currently involved in a 2-year SSHRC-funded project on STEM in early childhood. Hannah Bradley is an MA student at the University of Ottawa who is working in the area of early childhood STEM education. She has experience working with early childhood programs and conducting research in inquiry-based learning. And Dr. Todd Milford is an associate professor in science education and chair of the Department of Curriculum and Instruction at the University of Victoria. Since 2013, he's been exploring possibilities and challenges of early childhood STEM with Dr. Tippett. So welcome, Christine, Roxana, Hannah, and Todd.
Thanks so much for the opportunity for sharing. I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you right now from the traditional territories of Lekwungen speaking peoples, but my colleagues, and I come from Ontario as well, the area that we're coming from would be traditional territories of Algonquin peoples. And those areas have had a fair bit of impact upon my life, and I've been fortunate enough to have it. I'd also like to thank my presenters. I really love the Prezi. I love the color usage, and it was pretty flashy and pretty impressive. And I need to thank, obviously, the university and Faculty of Education for helping to fund part of this project. So although my name's first on this list, probably that's because of an affiliation. I really deserve to be maybe 5th or 6th inside this one, but I just want to make sure that one's clearly identified with my colleagues. We are taking a look at it. Christine and I, we predate COVID as far as how we've communicated. And since 2011, 12, when I was in Australia, we would Skype back and forth back in the day and try to figure out time zone right now of 3 hours different. Try it 15 hours difference. It's a lot harder. And the temperature change is a lot different between Queensland and Ottawa often too. So our topic area is supporting early childhood STEM education during the pandemic and afterwards, because it's very important, examining parents and early childhood educators' perceptions of a digital framework. My colleagues have been introduced, but I just wanted to acknowledge that this is very much a shared environment, and this is part of a larger project that is going and has been going for quite some time. Hannah, you're running the show, right? Thanks. Oops. I lost a slide, sorry. I can pull it up if you want. That's good. Nice. So what we're showing you here is a poster that we'll be presenting at CSSE in a couple of weeks. Obviously, this stuff is multifaceted, and we present a fair bit of information in different venues and different environments. But this one captures the idea and really kind of captures a fair bit of what's going to be happening in this presentation. We just wanted to give you this is a bit of a teaser because we expect you all to be at CSSE at our poster session, and we can send you the dates later on in the language. So from an overview, maybe next one, Hannah, please.
Is it sharing?
It is sharing, yep.
Okay.
But I'm still on the slide. I'm still on the poster slide.
I don't know why.
I can take it if you want.
If you want, yeah, maybe.
Sure. I'm gonna have to go, just give me a second, I'll pull it up. I don't have it out. Just give me
It
one
may not work, Todd. You don't have the fonts.
Oh yeah, on the font situation.
Let me try.
You try, Chris. Don't worry, we're used to,
Sorry.
typically when Chris and I do Zoom or Skype sessions, there's intermittent inside this all the time. Just gonna roll with it, it's good.
Here we go.
So from an overview point of view, and pay particular attention to the slides we have. These have all been vetted and approved, and there's no images inside. We'll give you an idea about context and then some objective of what our research was, our questions, a little bit of background from a theory point of view, literature that's really impacted us and where we're coming from, because as you probably understand, the literature is rich, but there's some seminal areas inside, and then what phases we are moving through inside our project. From a context point of view, the COVID virus has caused many, like many programs in our society, but many early childhood programs to close, and most centers are still impacted despite the fact that they've reopened. We know that ECEs, early childhood educators, rely on free online learning resources, and their parents do as well inside their interactions, both in the early childhood programs and as well at home. However, unfortunately, many of these hands-on learning resources available at no cost in our area of STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, are often of low quality, presented somewhat unsystematically, and while free, they They may suggest interesting learning experiences. They often fail to explicate the areas of STEM that we're focusing on. Thus, there was and really is a need for high quality and affordable, free in this case, early childhood STEM resources for ECEs, parents, and other caregivers to use during and after the pandemic. So that's the place that we really kind of focused what we're trying to look at from a contextual perspective.
Okay, so we have 3 goals for our project. The first goal is to create free, high-quality, evidence-based online STEM resources for early childhood educators, so ECEs, caregivers, and parents of young children ages 1.5 to 5 years old. The second objective, which is the main objective of my thesis, is to explore parents and caregivers and early childhood educators' perceptions of our resources. And our third objective is to redevelop the resources according to my findings to better meet the needs and expectations of our users. The main research question that I will be exploring is what are users' perceptions of our resources? Specifically, what are users' perceptions of our resources' pedagogical quality? What are users' perceptions of our resources' technical design quality? And how satisfied are users with our resources?
In terms of our theoretical background, social constructivism and play-based learning are the 2 theories that influence the development of our resources, as they influence most of Canada's early learning frameworks. Social constructivism, as you know, is a theory of learning strongly influenced by Vygotski's sociocultural theory. And in line with sociocultural theory, social constructivism suggests that children learn through interactions with more competent others. So in our projects, the ECEs, parents, caregivers who use our resources will take on the role of the more competent other and scaffold the children's learning. In terms of play-based learning, play is essential for young children's social, emotional, cognitive development. In other words, for their holistic development. In play-based contexts, educators adopt an emergent curriculum approach in which they observe the children's unique interests and curiosities and offer intentional learning experiences that capitalize on the children's interests. Our resources will be created from the children's interest expressed during free play and designed for children to purposefully explore STEM during play. In terms of STEM in early childhood, following other researchers, our perspective is that a learning experience to be considered STEM needs to highlight 2 of the 4 disciplines and incorporate the type of learning and emphasize 2 of those disciplines. Positive STEM early learning experiences support critical thinking, problem solving, literacy, and future learning. Our resources in our project are designed so that children can explore age-appropriate areas of STEM.
So now moving on to Pinterest, we chose Pinterest as the initial platform for sharing our resources, as literature suggests that educators and parents use Pinterest to find and curate educational resources. So, however, educators have expressed concerns over the quality of material found on Pinterest, and they note that if they perceive it to be of low quality or have errors, they are less likely to use it. So to ensure we're producing high quality resources for early childhood educators, caregivers, and parents, I'll be exploring users' perceptions of our resources. So the current project is broken up into 3 phases. The first phase is the development of the resources. The literature on social constructivism, play-based learning, STEM in early childhood, and Pinterest influenced the development of our resources. Phase 2 is the exploration of users' perceptions, which I will be doing with a questionnaire. The development of the questionnaire was influenced by literature that explores users' perceptions of digital educational resources, technical design quality, and pedagogical quality, as well as the literature on user satisfaction. Phase 2 will inform phase 3, which is the redevelopment of our resources, in which we will redevelop the resources according to my findings and reflect on our resources' successes.
Chris, you're muted.
Sorry, phase one, Hannah has reported that that will be resource creation. And in fact, phase one is well underway. We have begun this project by mobilizing data collected during the SSHRC-funded project that examined possibilities of STEM in early childhood. And when COVID hit, the members of our team individually were thinking about ways we could do something to support early childhood education and early childhood STEM education. And we had this data set. It captured purposeful, play-based STEM learning experiences for young children. And we thought we could harness that and have an impact during the pandemic and beyond. And so the UVic Faculty of Education grant was the starting point for this storehouse of learning experiences. We scoured our data set, we drew on our own teaching experiences and ideas, and we created 50 plus, although I think the specific number is 53, learning experiences that are freely available in multiple languages, so English, French, Spanish, with German to follow, and they're accessible via various social media platforms.
So all of our learning experiences can be accessed on our STEM in the Early Years Pinterest page. Our Pinterest page includes a series of pins. Each pin shows one of our learning experiences. So this is an example of one of our pins. It's showing our Walking the Creek learning experience. As you can see, the pin includes a title, images that show the learning experience, and a description on how the learning experience can connect to the disciplines. Slide, please. To provide more information about each learning experience, we developed a host website, which is linked to each one of our pins. So this webpage, which is providing more information about our Walking the Creek learning experience, is linked to the pin on the previous slide. Our website also includes other important information such as about us, how we define STEM, and other resources and references. So now moving on to phase 2, which is the exploration of user perceptions. Participants are early childhood educators, caregivers, and parents of young children who use our resources. For data collection, I've developed a questionnaire as there are currently none appropriate enough to use or modify. The questionnaire contains 2 components. The first one is a demographics component and the second one is a user perceptions component. The demographics component asks participants about themselves as well as the children that they use our resources with. The user perception component includes open-ended questions and closed-ended Likert statement questions that ask participants about their perceptions of our resources, technical design quality, pedagogical quality, and their satisfaction. So for example, in regards to the technical design quality of our resources, the questionnaire asks participants about our resources browsing and navigation design, as well as our resources platform design. For data analysis, I plan on calculating descriptive statistics and doing a thematic analysis.
Chris,
You're
you're muted
muted.
again. You're muted, Chris. Sorry.
We are moving into phase 3. Somebody did it at the same time, I feel like, where we will be redeveloping our resources, or if we get fairly positive feedback, we might leave our first 50 plus learning experiences as they are, and then just tweak our template for the future experiences that will develop, because we are in a partnership with a group of educators from highly regarded childcare centers in Ottawa, and we're going to be enhancing our storehouse of experiences with them.
So thanks to the grant that we received from the Faculty of Education COVID-19 Emergency Research Fund, we've been able to do a number of things. So one is to support young children, their educators, parents, and caregivers, in the context of COVID-19. So a fair bit of stuff going on while we went through this pandemic. Obtained SSHRC funding for a partnership with the City of Ottawa Childcare Centres that focuses on knowledge mobilization. The city's pretty excited, and this has been ongoing since excuse me, this was established during COVID. Share our work more widely than journals and conferences. So that idea of how we work as academics and how we're choosing some different avenues with which to disseminate some of our information. And then this idea about bridging research practice gap by connecting with our educators. And Chris has spoken about the work that these three are doing in Ottawa. We have a site here as well that we'll I think, potentially re-engage with and then maintain our relationship with this phase as well. So those are our impacts.
So now moving on to social media information, you can find us on Pinterest at STEM in the Early Years, or on Instagram at STEM in the Early Years. Or you can follow us on Twitter at Early Years STEM, or you can visit our website, www.stemintheearlyyears.com. Comments. Here's our contact information.
All right, and so we didn't assign anyone to this last slide, so I will start since I have remembered to unmute. Yay. Yes, please don't hesitate to reach out to one or any of us on the team, and please share our resources widely. So if you have young children of your own, excellent, or you know people with young children, share those resources. The further, the better.
So thanks very much, Todd, Chris, Roxana, and Hannah. That was fascinating. And it was really great to see the pins, actually, because they're so colorful. And I feel like kids would be drawn to them. So we do have a few comments in the chat. And I'd also like to invite the participants to indicate if they'd like to ask a question, or if they have a comment, you can just type the word question or comment if you'd like to speak. But I will read the comment here from Catherine. She asks, I wonder if you've considered creating a type of assessment tool that people might use to examine resources they find online. I'm thinking that your survey may be helpful in design.
So I can deal with that one. So Catherine, I sense you're talking about not general resources online, but resources associated with EC in the STEM. It's a little bit beyond scope or creep of what this one was, but yeah, it's certainly a place you kind of go back, and maybe some of the information we receive from Hannah's analysis of some of the qualitative responses can help inform that direction. And if I overspoke, my colleagues will easily come back in and add. They have no problems being.
Yeah, no, I definitely think it can be modified for other resources. There's an indicator context dependent quality, which from my overview of the literature, it seems that people kind of target more of what like the subject they're addressing, the population they're addressing, that's where they kind of change. But the other indicators are more general, such as like quality of text, quality of media, information reliability, relevance, workability. So it can definitely, I think, be modified for different resources.
Oh, and I see Catherine has posted another response here. There are some important principles you highlight, such as play and posing open-ended questions, for example.
Thanks, Dr. McGregor.
So I'll just leave another minute or so for any comments or questions that might anyone would like to share in the chat. I see that there was also some feedback on the first presentation. So thank you to Carrie, Alexander, and Lori for the feedback for the presenters who presented first.
I just wanted to add that the lovely pictures you saw in our presentation were the children that were our participants. So behind every picture, there was a lovely story. One of my favorite ones is a group of 3 girls building a tower and trying to figuring out like how to make the tower stay and be as tall as possible. So yeah, just wanted to like highlight that.
That's good to know. Those were your actual participants. Yeah.
And the little toddlers that were 1.5 to 2.5 were one of our big surprises, because we thought about preschool at the beginning, but the toddler educators wanted to join, and they ended up being super active and gave us lots of data. And yeah, that was one of the highlights of the process too.
Thanks for sharing that, Roxana.
Yes, I think that is a really important finding, because we started out thinking about preschool, and now we're talking about toddlers and preschoolers in separate groups. Like, we actually have the ability to collect data from those groups, and it's important. It's impressive, the kinds of things that we're finding, but not related to this necessarily, but in some other side analyses that we're conducting.
That's great. I see that a question has come in from Hong. I wonder if the COVID restrictions have influenced your development of the 50+ experiences, for example, social distancing, choosing a place, etc. So I think she's referring to the number of participants here. So have the COVID restrictions influenced how you managed 50+ participants?
So those 50+ learning experiences or activities were, those happened before COVID, but now we will find that out, because we will be working with educators who are amid the COVID pandemic. So we will see how that has impacted our new learning experiences that we will be exploring.
I think that most of our learning experiences can be done despite COVID in a group setting. So if the childcare center is still open, most of these activities are still possible. The educators, of course, just have to keep in mind all of the hygiene protocols, which will have some impact on some of the things, but these are just regular what the children would do, but we've provided a little more support for the educators to support the STEM.
Yeah, with lots of outdoors, because as it turned out, most of the interesting things happened outdoors, which is ideal in the context of COVID.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for those questions and comments, and a big thank you to Chris, Roxana, Hannah, and Todd for the presentation. Also, I'd like to thank our presenters from our first presentation, Kathy, Tanya, and Thiago. These have been both really insightful presentations, and I think people are taking a lot away. So thank you all. And I'd also like to thank all of you, the participants, for joining us today. It's really been great to have you here, and the series is continuing next week with our final session. So I'd just like to invite you to join us and let you know who will be presenting next week. So we have Dr. Ryan Rhodes, Dr. Sam Liu, and Dr. Alex Lithopoulos from Exercise Science, Physical and Health Education. And they'll be reporting on a couple of studies that they have undertaken since the start of the pandemic. One titled COVID-19 and its impact on health behavior, predicting physical distancing and physical activity in a representative sample of adult Canadians. And another study entitled Personality and Perceived Stress During the COVID-19 Pandemic, Testing the Mediating Role of Perceived Threat and Efficacy. We'll also have a presentation from Dr. Sarah Nutter in the School of Counseling Psychology. And her presentation is titled, How Does Communication of COVID-19 Risk Factors Influence Weight Stigma? So those will be taking place this same place, Zoom, next Wednesday, so a week from now. And we hope that you'll join us. And before we part ways for the day, I'd just like to give a shout out to the members of the organizing committee who all came together to make this magic happen. So Dr. Catherine McGregor, big thanks to Catherine for the inception for this series. Courtney Baldwin, who had to leave early, but she's been essential in providing technical support. Hector Vasquez, who's been in charge of live streaming to YouTube. Lauren Frost has done an amazing job with communications and media. And Elaine LaBerge, she came up with the concept for the poster that you see behind me and took care of the graphic design. So thanks to all of those members of the organizing committee. And again, thanks to the presenters. Thanks to all of you for joining us today. And as we go our separate ways, I'd like to wish you all a good rest of the day. Thank you.